There are kind of two parallel paths that are helping us in our climate fight. The first one is the idea of making a lot of money off of climate solutions, and the other one is saving the planet. And they're not always the same thing. My goals are pretty intersectional. I do want to stop and reverse climate change, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, etc. And also I want everyone to be able to live more equitable lives. I'm interested in and I care about that question. Part of our goal is that we believe in this thing that's going to fundamentally transform climate change, but also in doing so, we're going to create all these great jobs.
The job story is something that advocates of fighting climate change could do better. I think it could be the biggest job creation that we've ever seen.
The climate conversation has never been more divided. As disruptors in this space, we're hungry to find solutions to the challenges our environment faces. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. My name is Joel Caesar. I'm joined by Owen Barrett and Chris Pomerleau. We are experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. We celebrate those who take action against the climate crisis and are striving to make the world a cleaner place. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Welcome, everyone, to the Climate Rebels podcast. I am joined, as always, by the real estate oracle of Omaha, Chris Pomerleau.
Thank you.
The self-proclaimed Adam Newman of Green Building, Owen Barrett. Today, we are speaking to Lindsay Baker. She's the CEO of the International Living Future Institute. Man, we had a wide-ranging conversation learning about living buildings. I think what resonated with me is the idea that to create the future that we want, we have to envision ourselves in it. And living buildings, while extremely difficult to do, that's why it's called the challenge, as she described. There's only 30 in the world that have done it. They need to exist because that allows us to see and touch and feel what the future is supposed to look like. What do you guys think?
I did like how she said, envision what you want and kind of plan backwards. And I think that's a new way to look at it. Right now, sometimes we get so in depth on how do I fix tomorrow, but it's really what do we want to be in 20, 30, 40 years and how do we backwards plan off of that? So she had great things to say about that.
I love Lindsay's focus on the intersection of climate and equity. I think we're so focused on emissions and climate, but it's hard to be owners of apartment buildings and not think about equity.
It's a great point. But before we get to all that, let's dive into a segment we're calling Zero Bullshit. So today, we're going to reflect on the recently released Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report. So in this report, it's been getting a lot of headlines in the environmental sustainability climate community about how dire they're describing the situation to be about our progress to fight the climate crisis. I think it's important for us to take a zero bullshit approach. And for me, there was a piece about even if all of the governments in the world hit their emissions targets, which they're not on track to do, but let's assume they are, that still gets us, I think, about a 9% reduction against a 2019 baseline by 2030. Whereas the IPCC says we need to be at a 43% reduction against 2019 baseline. For us, that's a reminder that governments, politicians, regulation, that's not going to get us there. It's going to be entrepreneurs, it's going to be businesses, it's going to be disruptors. And I think that's a call to action for all of us that are in this space to create businesses that are disrupting, that we need to act faster and we need to act bolder.
I think we're in a little bit of a don't look up. You guys seen that Netflix movie?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course.
I mean, it's like how much of these reports are we going to put out before some decently powerful group of people really starts having an impact? And it makes me think about the 80-20 rule or the Pareto principle, whatever it's called. We just need to double down on the 20% that are going to do 80% of the work. And I don't think it's government. I think it's, Joel, to your point, I think it's private sectors. I think it's entrepreneurs. I think it's the passionate people that kind of are going to kick the rest of the people in the ass and get things moving.
It doesn't matter to me if it's 43% needed or 9%. This sounds like maybe cliche or perhaps too simple, but to take a sports reference, it's not over till it's over. Like, I don't care if it's 17%, 16%. If we have control over what we can control. So I'd much rather know that as the last ice cap is melting, that I've done everything I possibly could have, as opposed to find out then that if we just would have been okay with that 9%, or if we would have strived for that 13%, we would have been okay. And I just don't understand how there's any other fathomable concept in anybody's head other than to do everything they can. So these reports are somewhat unfortunate, but if anything, they should really motivate us all, for all of us that care, just to put their heads down and maybe in a positive way, don't look up. Put your heads down, get your stuff done, and commit to the whole process.
I mean, obviously these reports are important, but I think about the time and the resources that go into putting together these reports that are more or less just, hey, it's kind of like we said last time, but now it's worse. What if we focus that time and resources on actually doing something?
Right.
Well, I think you both make great points. And Chris, I like the sports analogy. And I think it's a mindset we have to celebrate and share more widely, because these reports are going to continue to come and they're going to continue to say more negative things. And we have to be careful that it doesn't just signal to future generations, you know what? You're fucked. So stop trying.
Right.
Because I think it's true. The news potentially will get worse, probably in our lifetimes. And that doesn't mean that we have to all be acting as boldly and swiftly as possible to try to solve the crisis.
Another cliche statement, they may get worse before they get better. I mean, who knows? You know, we just got to keep it up.
And today we have a very special guest. She is the CEO of the International Living Future Institute. She's a climate tech entrepreneur. She's former head of sustainability at WeWork. She's ex-Google. She's someone I admire and look up to deeply in the green building field. Please welcome Lindsay Baker to the Climate Rebels podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Lindsay, we like to get right to work here. And we have a question we ask all of our guests to start the show. How are you, a climate rebel?
You know, I guess what it is that I feel like I'm on a constant, maybe we'll say crusade. I don't know what the right word is, but it's a lifetime commitment to finding the levers for change that take one small action that we can make with some nice group of people, small group of people, that completely transforms an industry and hopefully the economy and our world and our culture. So there's kind of just something fundamentally unreasonable about that when you wake up every day thinking that you are trying to make that kind of change and that's generally speaking the frame that you apply to your work, then yeah, I think that feels pretty rebellious of the way that most people exist in the world, or just kind of the way that, like, what do you take as a given about our world? What do you think needs to change? I remember, like, when I was in high school, the school that I ended up going to for college, Oberlin College in Ohio, they sent a piece of paper, like the marketing materials that you used to get in the mail, when you were like a junior in high school or whatever. And it said, "Think one person can change the world, ? So do we." And I was like, yeah, I'm going there. That's exactly like how I think about things. It was a really good marketing slogan for a precocious high school student who wanted to go into the environmental world. So yeah, that's how I think I'm a rebel, is that it feels to me always like change needs to happen faster. And I wake up every day trying to figure out how to make that happen.
Well, very cool. Let's dive right into your current work as the CEO of the Living Future Institute. Chris and Owen, I don't know if you know this about me, but I consider myself one of the foremost experts in the world on living buildings. And now you're getting to watch me discuss the future of green building with the CEO of the Living Future Institute, who administers the Living Building Challenge. So, Lindsay, we always like to learn from our guests first. You know, the Living Building Challenge is rebellious in itself, and that's what attracted me to it and continues to make me an evangelist for it. But in your eloquent way here, tell us, educate us, what is the Living Building Challenge? What are you trying to do at the Living Future Institute? I know that's a big question, but let's jump off there.
I'll do my best to sum it all up, because all crazy ambitious organizations, it's complicated, and there's all these systems and ways that different people are doing different things that hopefully feed on each other to really do something incredible. But the basic premise of the Institute is really surrounding, I would say, the Living Building Challenge, which asks the question, what if a building gave back more positive impact to the world than what it consumes or takes out of the world in terms of resource flows? And in particular, we think about it from a climate perspective, an equity perspective, and a health perspective. So what if a building made you healthier? What if a building made a community more economically sustainable or allowed it to thrive more, created jobs that were good jobs? And then obviously on the climate side, it's all about producing more energy than you consume, cleaning your own water, all of that. So by asking that question specifically of a building, we really enable folks in the building industry to, I think of it kind of as like a 10x ambitious goal setting exercise. It's really to say, okay, we're not just trying to slightly do less bad in building a building. We're actually trying to go for something pretty ambitious, pretty hardcore. And so it started off as just an idea, as a philosophy, but then it pretty quickly became a certification program. This is a little bit like LEED for those that know what the LEED Green Building Rating System is. It's just fundamentally much harder. And I would say it's also kind of a different proposition, because what we're trying to do with it is a theory of change, right? This is like a term we use a lot in the nonprofit world. Our theory of change is you get a bunch of these buildings out there, it doesn't have to be that many, out into the world, and show people that it is possible to build a building that is in alignment with a positive future state, like a regenerative future state that we're all kind of wishing we could live in right now, that it might catalyze much faster, more transformational change to happen faster. So we now have, more than 30 of these very high, actual living buildings out in the world, but hundreds more and really thousands more that are using the principles in one way or another, or have gotten a piece of certification, which we call petal certification, like the petals of a flower, and a variety of other things. We certify products that are kind of in line with this goal. It's an ecosystem around this very ambitious target. But what it enables us to do is to really work with some of the biggest companies in the world. A lot of them are very ambitious in their climate targets in particular, to try to pursue something that's in line with Paris Agreement when it comes to, specifically setting their climate goals for real estate. So it's a fun place to be, because we get to be kind of uncompromising, I have to say, as a person who, as I said, I have unreasonable expectations for the world. It's a pretty great place. We're kind of known to be a little bit of the vanguard of the building industry, I think, when it comes to these kinds of issues. So yeah, I have a lot of fun every day. I'm enjoying it. I can't take all the credit. The organization's been around for a little over a decade, and I just started a year and a half ago, but it's a pretty good match. I'm happy to be here.
Well, for those of us who support the Living Billion Challenge, we're happy you're there too, and we're rooting for you.
I love the idea that you guys are trying to get enough momentum to cause, this tipping point in the industry. And I want to come back to that. But first, of the 30 buildings that have been certified, are they all new construction, or any existing buildings, have they become certified?
Yeah. We have some existing buildings that have become certified. My favorite is actually one I'm going to go to this week in Sacramento. It's a renovation project of an old building that was renovated into an office space. I would say it still requires some construction to be done in order to meet the challenge, which is kind of why I say it's a little bit like LEED in that way. Like you kind of have to buy things or do, change things in order to get there. And so there's something there, like, we aspire to being able to capture existing buildings more fully, but yes, we do have some renovations, and that is a even more of a heroic act in my mind, and really needed.
I mean, that's where I was going. We're trying to set the bar in the emissions territory of existing buildings. We're trying to do all net zero without offsets. But I think if we could take that same mentality to other arenas or other areas besides just climate within what our buildings do to the community or other things, I mean, I think it's something we should at least look into, Joel and Chris.
Yeah. What are some of the low-hanging fruit, Lindsay, that allows an owner to move a pre-existing building forward?
Specifically on this point of the health and equity impacts of buildings, one of the things I think that's pretty important is like the low-hanging fruit of just caring about the health impacts of your buildings, trying to figure out how to monitor that, understand all of the chemicals that are going into the building, et cetera. One of the programs we run is called the Red List program, which is basically we monitor scientific research around chemicals of concern for the human body. And we publish that list, specifically the list of chemicals that tend to be present in building materials. And we use that list to vet materials that can and can't be used in a living building. And so in terms of low-hanging fruit, I think even just picking a couple of products that you're going to try to phase out anything that might be harmful to the human body and say, okay, from now on, all of our flooring is going to be Red List free, is a really nice way to just get started and sort of understanding how that kind of stuff can work. With an existing building, I commend you all. I think I was just thinking the other day about what an amazing mobilization of workforce and great minds and sort of business models we're about to go through in the next decade to try to renovate all these buildings. Like the percentage, we have to renovate something like, I want to say it's maybe 4% of the U.S. global building stock every year in order to hit our climate targets. And right now, I think it's maybe 1% that gets renovated every year. So just thinking about sheer magnitude of transition that we're going to have to go through and how that works. Like, how do we target all of these different things? Getting windows replaced. It sounds so unsexy. I can't believe we're talking about this on a podcast where we're talking about being rebellious, but like, those are the heroes out there, man. People replacing old windows with new windows.
It's a theme of our business, which I think maybe would behoove the listeners and yourself, Lindsay, to tell us more about what we're doing to give context to this conversation. But you don't have to be sexy to be rebellious. I think one of our key messages here is there's existing technology that we just need to deploy with new business models faster and at scale to hit our goals. I mean, I came from, you and I know each other. I helped develop the City of Santa Monica's Living Building Challenge project. I've heard you on another podcast recently talk about what's cool about the Living Building Challenge is coupling ancient solutions with modern technology. And the Santa Monica building is exactly that. We're using composting toilets to manage the on-site solid waste. But that being said, what we're trying to do is buy existing apartment buildings and convert them to net zero. And what I think is interesting about the conversation of simple and non-sexy, and I'd love Owen to dive more into this, because we had, over the last few years, we've been trying to launch this business in a lot of ways for years, and we've had some success. But we've talked to, and I'm going to use air quotes, Owen's favorite thing, impact investors. And we've shown them the business model. And we say, look, we can buy this apartment building and add 50% solar to it. And that's going to give you a market rate return for what you expect to do a multifamily acquisition value add. And they say, great, do that, please. We can say we're impact and we're still getting our 18 to 25% IRR. Owen would then say, but you could go net zero for a 12% IRR. And they would be like, no, thank you. We just like the typical return. So is that impact? Is that not? And I think there's a conversation probably to be had here with the Institute at some point too, about the net zero certification and how that can help some of these scaled conversations with impact investing. But Owen, maybe you can tell that story a little bit better and bring some light to the stories that you encountered.
Well, I think too, just going off the sexy conversation, I would actually argue that we need more boring, pragmatic approaches. I think the world chases these shiny, sexy objects, and that gets attraction of VCs, and that gets people, one of our favorite statistics is something Joel picked up at a conference, that of all the VCs focused on climate, they're spending 10x more money on carbon accounting solutions than actual solutions that reduce carbon, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
so
Lindsay loves that one, I'm sure.
It's just this conversation for us and this focus of, we have the technology. It's there. It's ready to be deployed. We have what we need. We just need to do it faster. And Joel and I and Chris have been on so many conversations with people where they say, it's an interesting model, but what kind of storage are you implementing? Or what kind of this are you putting in your buildings? And we're, like Joel alluded to, we're already struggling to maintain this 20% IRR or whatever is required. And if you're forced to put in more technology, it's just going to increase the cost, reduce the returns. And so it's just this challenge that we've been facing for years.
Yeah, I would like to sort of at least say what I think that challenge comes down to, like what I'm interested in, or that I think we kind of need to face as a community, which is that there are kind of two parallel paths that are helping us in our climate fight. The first one is the idea of making a lot of money off of climate solutions. And the other one is saving the planet. And they're not always the same thing. And some people are really only interested in the first one.
Yeah.
The idea that this can be really profitable. And so when that motivation shows up, it's that we're doing this because we think we're going to make a lot of money. There's a lot of things that you see, carbon accounting softwares, and a lot of investment in new infrastructure, and a lot less interest and commitment to things that are just kind of labor intensive.
Yeah.
Or require, complicated bureaucracy moves or something like that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be making money. Like, people are going to make a lot of money on solar and batteries and all of these things. But there's also like a job creation story that we need to tell ourselves. So I guess what I'm saying in part is I think it's helpful to take people back to the real sort of core goals of what they're trying to accomplish. And for me, my goals are pretty intersectional. I do want to stop and reverse climate change, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, etc. And also I want everyone to be able to live more equitable lives. I'm interested in and I care about that question. And I think a lot of people do too when you just draw it out. And so if you could say to folks like, hey, we could put batteries in, But part of our goal is actually that we believe in this thing that's going to fundamentally transform climate change. But also in doing so, we're going to create all these great jobs. And that's where we're putting our money, is in renovations.
Yeah. I feel like the job story is something that advocates of fighting climate change could do better. I think it could be the biggest job creation that we've ever seen, but that's not really talked about that much.
It's not. There's actually a great report from E2. It's this nonprofit organization, looks at like climate jobs. It was a few years ago, but it was something, they were pointing out something like 3.5 million jobs in the US could already be categorized as clean economy jobs. And when you dive into that data, about 2 million of those are building industry specific.
Yeah.
So when you think about who is the clean economy employing, or what industries are already contributing to that world, like we get to take credit for a lot of those jobs. And that's pretty exciting, I think, because it kind of means like the more money we can get from the feds or from private industry or investors, the more we're going to put that into really great jobs. And they're great jobs. Like a lot of these are pretty cool. I mean,
Yeah.
who doesn't want to learn how to install a solar panel?
High paying jobs too.
That's cool. Yeah, exactly.
Lindsay, I heard you on a podcast recently describe something that excites you about your role and about your career as the intersection of climate and buildings. Chris here, I'll let him describe himself better than I will, but I would say he was not a climate entrepreneur. Owen introduced the idea of adding solar to multifamily acquisitions. It's Chris's business. He's great at it. He's a real estate entrepreneur, definitely wants to do right by the planet, definitely wants to do right by his community. So I think there's probably an interesting conversation here. You went into buildings because you wanted to save the planet. You're an environmentalist. And then, Chris is now being brought in. He's a real estate guy. He's a buildings guy. Now he's doing it with us. We're doing it together. But we've introduced the idea that we can solve climate crisis while making money as a real estate entrepreneur. So I think, how would you help bring more Chris's into the realm of climate and buildings? And Chris, feel free to add anything else with your journey here.
I'd love to hear about more Chris's. It's not difficult to find individuals, well, obviously not as successful as you, Lindsay, but people with the same heart and ideas as you that want to implement these things. That's not difficult. The hard part is, unless you somehow incentivize this through some government programs, and even more rebellious, governmental programs that are actually providing housing from the government, which is a slippery slope. In my opinion, you're going to have to incentivize the private sector to implement these. And it's not so much that that's a devilish or a negative way to look at it, but if you use the numbers Joel mentioned, in our entire business, I have 4 real estate businesses, and they're 100% dependent upon investment money. It's extremely difficult to sell somebody to say, here's $100,000 of my hard-earned money. I'm really excited to make single-digit returns because I care about the fabric, the type of your carpet and what it's emitting. And it's very difficult to do that. And so if we can be intuitive enough or figure out a way to implement these ideas, but also minorly or very small amount affect the investment outcome, then I think it's a lot easier. And I actually think we've done that. I think we're doing that through net metering and large bills being billed to the complex as a whole. If solar is implemented, water conservation, I think we've found a way to do these things, but a lot of people don't open their minds to it. And I think that if we want this to happen, it's going to be that bureaucratic uphill battle that you spoke about, because you want to incentivize the public to help out on this process. Because I think there's plenty of people that want to help, but there aren't a lot of people that just want to volunteer their money to help. And that's the hardest part.
Yeah, you're highlighting something. There's 2 fights to fight. There's the financial one, and there's the one about why we do what we do. Like we all spend money on one thing or another, and it's usually somewhat motivated by our values or making a better life for our kids or whatever that is. So a lot of the work that I think we have to do in our movement around climate is to make sure that people have a good sense of how their values can manifest in the decisions they make and in the sort of the way that they buy things and all of that, so that they know, okay, if I have a choice, I got $1, am I going to spend it on this light bulb? I'm going to spend it on this light bulb. That they know which one would be more in line with their values, and sort of like just make sure that that education is there first and foremost. It's the responsibility of us as culture creators and influencers, as well as things that, there are things the government can do to kind of help make that clear or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, I don't think that we necessarily are asking people to spend more on this. I think one of the things we work on, for example, is asking the question, why is it more expensive to buy a carpet that has a lot of toxic chemicals in it than not? Especially when you know that a chemical is an actual product that somebody made and costs something. And so when you extract that and say, okay, let's make this carpet from wool instead of from, something that's got some carcinogens. It starts to become more of a head scratcher, and you really get to the core of, well, what are we incentivizing? What is the government already incentivizing, or what is private industry incentivizing right now? And the reality is, the government has a fair amount of financial backing for a lot of businesses that do harm to the environment today. So a lot of what we're talking about doing is shifting those government and sort of private sector supports from the stuff that isn't good for us and isn't good for the planet to the stuff that is. So a lot of the work that we do is sort of designed to do that. It's designed to sort of shift resources where they need to go, such that individual folks don't have to bear the cost of that transition. Even just the idea of carbon emissions, I think folks kind of generally get a sense, okay, well, our kids might really be impacted by climate change, and our grandchildren might too, but it's harder to say, okay, then I'm going to spend $50,000 trying to prevent that from happening, right? A lot of us don't have that choice, just frankly, right?
And I appreciate you saying that. And that's actually why we're all so excited about what we're launching, Rayven, because it is a little rebellious as far as an investment opportunity, because it's so concentrated on this decarbonization and net zero, and it provides double-digit returns to people that typically may not even have a chance to get into real estate. Many people do have a chance, but the people who are willing to join the team and press against or fight for the climate change, they have an opportunity to get in. And I think that the lower barrier of entry for the people that really want to get in and help is something that's huge for us. So, but we're really excited about it.
I have a question that came to mind. I'm curious if you have any insight on it. When we bought a building about a year ago that had some pipes burst in the big Texas freeze. So the heat was gas, but the pump that pumped the hot water through the building was electric. So an electric went out, the pump went out, and then the pipes froze and burst. And so when we bought the property, we approached our insurance company and said, we have a very simple solution, a $35,000 solution to basically back up that electric pump so that if this ever happens again, the hot water doesn't stop circulating, you won't get frozen pipes. Will you guys reduce our premium so that we can afford to put this in? And they flat out said no. They said no way. Which I thought was fascinating, right? Because the renovation bill on the property was over $1 million. So we were asking them, we'll put in a $35,000 fix to prevent you guys from paying over $1 million in future renovation costs. They said no. Do you think there's any opportunity in healthier buildings in the intersection of insurance to persuade developers to go this route? And what you and Chris were talking about, trying to take some of the money off of us or the developers or the people that would be paying out of pocket?
Yes, I think you're onto something. The first part is, how do we get the insurance industry to really value the risk appropriately? And you're starting to see some pretty cool rebels. Hopefully you can find one for the show, who are looking at the realm of insurance and trying to really understand, how are we going to insure, buildings, for example. I'm sure that if you were to ask that insurance company to really get to the bottom of their assumptions of why they didn't want to pay for that, it's because they think it's never going to happen again. It's because their models are based on historic data, a lot of weather models, that they're using or whatever it is. They're assuming it's just not going to happen again, so they're never going to incur that cost. There is a growing movement of, God bless them, not very sexy insurance professionals who are basically trying to say, no, we actually know there are climate models now that are showing us what future weather events might look like that would tell us that the pipes are going to burst again in Texas. And so it does then pencil out to do these different things and to make different real estate investments. On the health front in particular, I think the insurance industry and all of us were really jolted awake by the pandemic in terms of how much buildings can impact our health. And so now, you do see a lot more people willing to or feeling the necessity of managing that risk of what impact buildings can have on just core metrics. People living or dying here in the case of the pandemic, but in the case of other things too, there are some really serious things that can happen in a building that can harm our health. And we know so much more about that than we ever did. It's just hard. I think we're still spending some time trying to make sure we can take all that research or all that professional wisdom, whatever it is, and make sure that the insurance industry really sees that. Same thing with, I was going to say with Chris's stuff, it's a lot of what you're talking about there is how do we get really good financial markets that are properly valuing this type of work? And it's exciting and scary what's happening with the SEC right now around environmental, social, and governance, ESG disclosures, because it's basically starting to say you're going to have to provide this data about your companies and we're going to value you that way. Understandably, some people have issues with that. We're getting closer to a really effective way of pushing money to the right places to get this stuff to happen. And we're already seeing it every day. I mean, there are a lot of investors out there who are looking to invest in companies because they are managing their own risk and they believe that they need to invest in companies that are going to be a part of the solution and not the problem, such that, their business still exists 50 years from now because we all as a species still exist 50 years from now. So there's a risk there. It's a business risk. That's the crudest way to put the potential downfall of society, but that's the thing. That's what they're trying to value.
Let's segue, Lindsay. I want to get back to living buildings, and I think we're going to run out of time. I so badly wanted to get to the WeWork side because as I introduced Owen, he's the self-proclaimed Adam Newman of green building. But I think this conversation about, and I know you agree, there is simple, non-sexy business models like we're describing, we're working on that are important and need to happen and need to scale. But there's living buildings that need to happen because they show us what good looks like. And I know that means a lot to you. Maybe you can describe why that's important.
Yeah. I've been working a little bit, spending some time on what I think this whole transition is going to look like. My professor at Oberlin is a guy named David Orr, definitely a climate rebel. I'm sure he would love that term. He would be like, yes, this is me. And he used to say, you cannot effectively fight for a future that you can't envision. You need to spend some time trying to figure out where you're trying to get to and then work your way back. As an environmentalist, I think that was a really important point because a lot of us can just kind of be like, oh, trash, clean it up. Oh, emissions, stop. But really envisioning what it's going to look like, what the economy is going to look like, et cetera, that's a fundamentally important part of being able to do this work well. And so what I'm imagining is that we take these living buildings, we take programs like the Living Building Challenge, like LEED, et cetera. The way that those work is that we've got a bunch of smart people who sit around and they look at a bunch of pieces of paper about a building and they say, yeah, you did a great job. You did all the right things. This is healthy. This is good for the community. This is good for the environment. More and more cities every day in America are passing ordinances, changing building codes, trying to incentivize people to build in ways that are fundamentally better for the planet. And they're doing that in part because they've established their own climate action plans. They're part of the Paris Agreement, whatever it is. We need more city workers to be equipped the way that my team is equipped, to actually go into every building and say, this is a great building. We need a world where, frankly, where the kinds of buildings that you guys are building become the expectation for all cities, for all buildings across the board. You're going to be ahead of that, which is why you'll make a nice return in many ways, because more and more people are going to need to do this. But at the end of the day, the vision that I have is that all those buildings are going to have solar panels on them. And that will probably be required because that's more or less what we need. Now, I don't want to get into the semantics of like the solar panels could be somewhere else or they could be on the building or who cares. But the point is, we will eventually get to a world where to be able to own and run a building in any city means that it needs to be healthy and it needs to be not contributing to the pollution of our planet. And it should probably be pretty good for the community as well. And we will have standards for that. And that'll just be the expectation of how buildings should be built. I don't think that's crazy. I understand it sounds pretty far off. It's not all that different from other things that the government does in terms of saying, hey, if you're in this city, you got to do this. These are the speed limits. These are the, these are the emission standards for our cars. We're going to have similar things for buildings. So the goal, I think, is to create these programs in the voluntary world to show how it is possible, but also to sort of build up that toolkit of what it means to kind of referee this stuff. So that one day when we start having more and more cities that essentially have really good building performance standards, like the one in New York City, Local Law 97, we can equip those city workers to be able to evaluate quickly and efficiently and develop all their cool back-end systems so that we can hand those keys over to the essentially local city governments to say, okay, this is how we want buildings to be built in Dallas, and this is how we want buildings to be built in St. Louis, and this is how we want buildings to be built in any part of the world, really.
Well, it's interesting too. The building I worked on in Santa Monica, we thought a lot about that, the responsibility of the city itself to prove the model. And that project became a lightning rod politically in the city for a lot of reasons. But eventually, because it did get so much press, sometimes negative, sometimes positive, so much conversation around it, the Living Building Challenge is now in the vernacular of the city of Santa Monica staff, of the journalists, of the community. And that's a place where people can go and see and touch and feel what the future is supposed to look like. So of course, I know you agree. That's a really important part of what we're trying to do in this field.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Lindsay,
people need to see the things, they need to walk through them. It becomes pretty exciting then.
Are you optimistic that the change is going to happen as fast as it needs to?
Before you answer that question, we're out of time. It's actually the question we'd like to end on. So in a way, he already asked it. But we try to end the conversation, Lindsay, with the question of, we're all about optimism. We're about celebrating the people that are doers, the people that are rebellious, the people that are disrupting. We know you're all those things. So let's not get caught up in the negativity around the challenges we face. What gives you hope? What gives you optimism for the future?
Wow. So many things give me hope. I actually, I mentioned Dallas, and I was just thinking, this one little example. There's a mayor of Dallas, Texas, who has brought in a bunch of wonderful people in his administration who are doing great things to try to transform that city. And that's Dallas, Texas. That is not San Francisco, and it's not New York City. And it just takes one mayor with a great vision to change a lot of things in that community and to sort of get the things started, to hire the right people, to bring in the right conversations. It's not rocket science. It's just great leadership, confidence, the belief that we can and need to do things to change. So I don't know much about the mayor of Dallas, Texas, but I just heard that story, and I hear stories like this every day, that when people come to us to start working with us, there's usually at the beginning of the story of why they showed up at our doorstep is someone who just decided that they wanted to do something good for the world. It's nothing more than that. And there's so many people who do that every day that I'm pretty busy just trying to keep up with the expectations of those types of folks. And it's that ambition that is going to fuel the world changing the way that it needs to. We need more people to do that. A lot more people, especially people in positions of power. And we need to elect more people into positions of power to get that done as well. But that's all it takes. It takes a little bit of motivation. I think the quote was something along the lines of, we can still save ourselves, but we just have to not be lazy. It's like a real basic thing, just get you back into it. I stay optimistic because every day somebody's going to wake up and realize that they have the potential to change the world in a positive way. Sounds like you guys are feeling motivated for that. So Godspeed, good luck. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, Chris, as much as we need you to run our business, I think Lindsay wants you to run for mayor of Omaha. So.
Do it, Chris.
Okay. All right. I'll add it to my to-do list.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. We didn't get to WeWork. We didn't get to your climate tech startup. So much we could have covered. So we'll have to have you back. Please take the opportunity. How do we find you? Plug your stuff. I know you got a podcast. You got a conference coming up. Tell us where to find you.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, our podcast, Design the Future podcast, we interview women working in the sustainability world around the built environment. And it's a lot of inspirational stories. So definitely check that out if you're a podcast listener, which you are by definition if you are listening to me say this. It's a good one. I think it's, especially if you're interested in just this type of stuff we're talking about. There's a lot of career paths and things we talk about there. Our conference is coming up, Living Future 2023. By the time you hear this, it may be a little late, but if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, it is May 3rd through 5th. And you can find the Institute at living-future.org, which is a good way to find out more about what we're up to. You can find me on LinkedIn. I try to post controversial stuff and keep the dialogue going.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. And thank you everyone for joining. You can find us on most of the social media platforms at Join Rayven. That's Join and Rayven with a Y. You can find this podcast and more great content at joinrayven.com. Again, that's Rayven. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to fight the climate crisis?